I lost everything on a Wednesday. Not the house, not the money, not even my health, though that came close. What I lost on that Wednesday was the quiet certainty that the woman sleeping beside me for 23 years was actually someone I knew. Welcome back to American Home Voices. Get yourself comfortable, put the kettle on, and settle in. The people in these stories had every opportunity to do right by the ones who loved them. They simply chose otherwise. Leave a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. My name is Bernard Calloway. I'm 64 years old, semi-retired from a structural engineering firm. I spent 31 years building from a one-room office in outer Brisbane to a company with 43 staff and projects across 3 states. I drove a faded green Land Cruiser that my wife had been asking me to replace for 6 years, and I made the best lamb roast in our postcode. I state that without a skerrick of false modesty. I was, by every reasonable measure, a man who had built a good life with both hands and held on to it carefully, or so I believed. It was a Wednesday in late March when my colleague and closest friend of 19 years, a man named Phil Drummond, found me slumped sideways in my office chair, with my reading glasses still on and a structural report half printed on the desk beside me. He said my face had gone the color of old concrete. Phil is not a man given to panic. He spent 15 years in the Army before he came to work for me. And the only time I'd ever seen him rattled was when his youngest daughter got her driver's license. He called the ambulance first. Then he called my wife. I don't remember the drive to hospital. I don't remember the paramedics. Though Phil told me later one of them was barely old enough to shave and still managed to keep me stable the whole way. What I remember is something strange and flat and very quiet, like standing in a paddock at 4 in the morning when there's no wind and no birds and the dark just sits on top of you without pressing down. And then a voice, sharp and direct, cutting clean through it. Stay with me, Mr. Calloway. Stay right with me. When I came fully to, I was in intensive care at the Royal Brisbane. There were tubes and monitors and a particular kind of overhead light that exists nowhere else in the world except hospitals and car parks. A nurse named Sandra, a compact woman with short gray hair and the calm efficiency of someone who has seen every possible version of a bad day and decided years ago not to be surprised by any of them, was checking something above my head without looking at me. How long? I managed. She looked down at me then. 3 days, Mr. Calloway. 3 days. You had a significant cardiac event, she said, in the measured tone of someone choosing every word deliberately. The surgical team intervened twice. You're stable now. You're very fortunate. I looked around the room slowly. There was a card on the windowsill from the office. A bunch of yellow chrysanthemums that I later learned Phil had driven 40 minutes to find because he remembered I'd once said yellow flowers were the only kind that didn't look funereal. There was a get well text printed and taped to the wall by my bed. Phil again, I was certain. And there was a chair beside the bed, pulled close, a box of tissues on the seat, and a paperback novel left open face down on the armrest. But the chair was empty. Where's my wife? I asked. Sandra straightened the monitoring lead on my wrist, with the careful attention of a woman who has learned to give her hands something to do when her face might otherwise say too much. She's been informed, she said. She rang this morning to check on your progress. Rang. Not. Came. Rang. She rang. I repeated. Yes. She said she'd be in as soon as she could manage. I looked at the ceiling. The air conditioning vent above me had a small piece of tape over one corner from where someone had once tried to redirect the airflow. I stared at that tape for a long time. She rang. I said again. To no one in particular. Sandra finished what she was doing and touched my forearm once, very briefly. And then she left to fetch the attending cardiologist. That was the first crack. Small enough that you could almost miss it. The kind of fracture that looks like nothing until the light hits it a certain way. And then you can't understand how you ever looked at the wall without seeing it. Dr. Anita Prasad came in half an hour later. She was younger than I expected, which I noticed, and more direct than I was prepared for, which I appreciated. She explained what had happened with the calm thoroughness of someone who respects the person they're speaking to enough to tell them the truth without softening it into meaninglessness. Major cardiac event. Arterial blockage. Emergency intervention. Twice. She needed me resting, monitored, stress-free, and not alone for a minimum of 2 weeks. I told her my wife would be coming. She looked at me the way people sometimes look at you when they know something you don't and have made a professional decision not to be the one to tell you. It was a look I wouldn't properly understand until much later. She also mentioned, setting down her clipboard carefully, that she'd spoken briefly with my wife by phone, that there was apparently a trip planned. I blinked. A trip? To the Whitsundays, Dr. Prasad said. She said it was booked some months ago. I remembered. A week on Hamilton Island. My wife's sister, Lorraine, had organized it. A group of women, old friends, a milestone birthday for one of them. It was in the calendar. 6 days. We'd discussed it casually over dinner sometime in January. It was supposed to start in 4 days. She can postpone, I said. Dr. Prasad picked up her clipboard. Mr. Calloway, she said, and I want you to understand this clearly. You cannot be on your own right now. I understand, I said. She'll postpone. The look again. The one I didn't understand yet. Phil came to see me that evening. He walked in carrying a paper bag from the bakery near our office, looked at the hospital dinner sitting untouched on the tray table, and said, without breaking stride, that he was performing a public service. He pulled up a chair, handed me a meat pie wrapped in paper, and for a while we talked about nothing of any great consequence. A junior engineer on his team, who had recently discovered strong opinions about workplace coffee and was making them everyone's problem. Then the air between us shifted. Has Margaret been in? He asked. He kept his eyes on the pie wrapper he was folding in his hands. She's coming, I said. She just needs to sort a few things. Phil nodded. The kind of nod that is not actually agreement. Phil, yeah. What do you know that you're not telling me? He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me directly, which Phil always does when he's about to tell you something he wishes he didn't have to. Nothing's certain, he said. But Bernard, mate, I need you to get better first. That's the only thing right now. I studied his face. Phil Drummond is, among other things, a man constitutionally incapable of sustaining a convincing lie. He once tried to organize a surprise dinner for my birthday and accidentally rang me instead of his wife to confirm the booking. Whatever he was carrying in that moment was something heavy and specific, and he had made the decision, out of loyalty, to carry it a while longer himself. I let him. I was exhausted, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion was a thought I didn't want to finish, so I left it unfinished and fell asleep while Phil was still there, sitting with the quiet patience of a man who had been in worse places and knew how to wait. My wife rang that night. Her voice was warm and worried. All the right notes, in all the right order. Bernie, I've been out of my mind, she said. Are you all right? Are they looking after you properly? I coded twice, I said. They brought me back twice. A pause. I know, she said. I know. It's been frightening. Then come, I said. Silence. Bernie, the trip is in 4 days. Lorraine's already at the airport hotel. Everyone's flights are booked. You know what Jan's birthday means to the group. I said her name the way you say someone's name, when you're asking them to stop performing and hear you. Margaret, I'm going to be right there the second we're back, she said. A week goes fast. You have the best doctors. You have Sandra and the team there. I need my wife." Her voice shifted. Underneath the warmth, there was something harder, something load-bearing that I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't been looking for. "You're stable, Bernard. You're safe. It's a week. Who else is going?" I asked. "Other than Lorraine in January." A pause. "The usual group," she said. "Deborah, Fiona, Wendy." "Right," I said. "That's what I said." "Right." She sounded surprised. Maybe relieved. "I love you," she said. "I know," I said. "Have a good trip." I hung up and lay in the blue-gray quiet of the ICU and felt something move inside me. Not anger. Anger is loud, and whatever this was had no sound to it at all. It was something precise and very clear, the way water goes clear when it finally stops moving. They flew out on Saturday. I know this because Phil mentioned in passing on Friday evening that he'd been caught in traffic near the domestic terminal. I know it because Sandra came in on Saturday morning to check my vitals and asked, very gently, if I had family visiting over the weekend. I know it because I called the house 3 times that afternoon and heard nothing but the long, empty sound of a phone ringing in a room where no one was. I lay in that hospital bed for 6 days without my wife. The doctors said I had come back from the edge. What they couldn't have known, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that the man who came back had arrived somewhere slightly different from where he'd started. Quieter, more patient, the way a river looks calm on the surface right before you realize the current underneath is moving faster than anything you'd want to swim against. They came home on a Friday afternoon, and when they walked through the front door of our house, tanned and laughing, bags in the hallway, the sound of women calling out to each other in the driveway, I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea and the newspaper. I heard my wife come through the door. I heard a second voice, a man's voice. She found me in the living room. She stopped short when she saw me sitting there. I had come home from hospital 2 days earlier, which she knew, because I had told her by phone. "Bernie," she said. "You're up." I looked past her. Standing in the hallway, one hand still on his travel bag, was a man I recognized after a moment as Kieran Mossgrove, 47 years old. He ran a property development firm that had offices in the building next to ours on Adelaide Street. I had met him twice, perhaps 3 times, at industry events. He was the kind of man who remembered what drink you ordered and told you about it the next time he saw you, like a trick he'd practiced until it felt natural. He looked at me the way a man looks at a situation he had believed was under control and has just realized is not. I set down my tea. "Kieran," I said pleasantly, "I don't believe we've met here before." My wife said something about them sharing a taxi from the airport, about Kieran having been in the Whitsundays at the same time. What a coincidence. He'd run into the group on the first day. Her voice had the slightly elevated brightness of a person improvising with good raw material. I looked at Kieran. I looked at his bag. Not a briefcase. Not a jacket. A soft overnight bag, half-zipped, with what appeared to be a toiletry case tucked into the side pocket. "Come in," I said, still pleasant. "Both of you. There's something I'd like to talk to you about." They came into the living room. My wife sat on the edge of the armchair she always sat in. Kieran remained standing until I gestured at the couch, at which point he sat in the careful way of a man very aware of where his hands are. I reached across to the side table and picked up the folder that had been sitting there since Thursday morning. "Now, before I tell you what happened in the months after I came home from that hospital, I need to take you back to the week before everything finally came apart, because the confrontation in that living room didn't happen by accident. It happened because I had been very, very careful. During those 6 days in the ICU, I had a great deal of time to think, and at some point in the second day, lying there with the monitors beeping and the chrysanthemums turning slightly at the edges, I made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a wounded one, A clear, clean, entirely rational decision made by a man who had just been on the other side of consciousness and come back with the particular focus that grants. I was going to pay attention. Phil came to see me every single day I was in hospital. On the fourth day, when I had more strength, I asked him directly, not what he suspected, what he knew. He closed the door of the room. He sat down, and he told me. It had started, according to Phil, approximately 9 months before my heart attack. Phil had seen my wife's car parked in the Adelaide Street building on a Tuesday evening. A Tuesday when I was in Sydney for a project consultation. He hadn't thought too much of it. A few weeks later, at an industry luncheon, he'd seen my wife and Kieran Mossgrove standing together near the windows for a long time, talking in the way people talk when they've forgotten they're in a room with other people. He still hadn't said anything to me. There was nothing certain, he said. He hadn't wanted to be wrong, but he'd watched. The way a careful man watches something he hopes won't become what he fears it already is. He told me about 3 separate occasions over the following months. Her car in that building's car park, a restaurant in New Farm that neither of us had ever been to together, where Phil had gone for a client dinner and seen the two of them at a corner table. A Sunday afternoon when Phil was walking his dog along the river path, and my wife and Kieran had passed him going the other direction, close together, not holding hands but with the particular closeness of people who do. She hadn't seen Phil. Kieran hadn't either. I should have told you sooner, Phil said. He looked at the floor. You're telling me now, I said. That's not good enough. Phil. I held up my hand. I need you to listen to me, because what I'm about to ask you to do is going to require your absolute confidence, and I need to know you're with me. He looked up. I'm with you, he said. Whatever you need. Mamorgris. I believed him completely. I have believed Phil Drummond completely for 19 years, and he has never once given me a reason to revise that. Here is what my wife did not know when she walked back through our front door with Kieran Mossgrove's overnight bag in the hallway. She did not know that I had spent the 3 weeks since leaving hospital meeting quietly with my solicitor, a woman named Elaine Forsyth, who had handled my business affairs for 11 years and who, when I walked into her office and explained the situation, had listened without interrupting and then said, with the measured directness I had always admired in her, "Right. Let's make sure this is done properly." She did not know that Elaine, over those 3 weeks, had restructured the significant majority of our joint assets into a private trust in my name, entirely legally, entirely documented, entirely complete. The joint account remained funded for household expenses through to June. Nothing more. She did not know that the house, which we had purchased at a time when her income from her interior design practice had been inconsistent, and the mortgage had consequently been secured entirely under my borrowing capacity, remained in my name alone. Elaine had reminded me of this gently, along with several other details I had not thought to revisit in 23 years of assuming everything was held in common because we were common to each other. She did not know that I had filed for divorce 11 days before she came home from the Whitsundays. She did not know that I had spoken at length with my son, Daniel, who was 31 and lived in Melbourne, and who had driven up to Brisbane and spent 4 days with me in hospital without his mother knowing, because he had rearranged his work schedule the moment Phil called him, and he had sat beside my bed and held my hand on the second day and said, "Dad, I love you and I need you to be okay." And I had looked at my son's face and thought, this is what showing up looks like. This is what it has always looked like. And she did not know that 2 days before she came home, I had sat down with Phil and a very specific piece of information we had confirmed through professional channels. Kieran Mossgrove's property development firm had been in quiet preliminary discussions with our engineering company regarding a significant joint tender for a commercial development project in Fortitude Valley. These discussions were at an early stage. No contracts had been signed. I had, on Thursday, made a phone call, so, When they came into the living room and sat down, and my wife began to arrange the narrative about taxis and coincidences, I let her finish. I let her get all the way to the end. I'm a structural engineer. I know that the time to assess a structure is after it's fully assembled, not while it's still going up. Margaret, I said. When she stopped talking, I said it quietly. Not hard, not sharp. The way you say a word when you want it to carry weight without making noise. I'm not going to ask you to explain this. I don't think an explanation is what either of us needs right now. Her face moved through several expressions. She landed on something that looked like the beginning of an argument, and then looked at the folder in my hand and thought better of it. I slid the folder across the coffee table. Those are divorce papers, I said. Filed 11 days ago. My solicitor's name is Elaine Forsyth. You'll remember her from the business restructure we did in 2019. She's been thorough. Everything is documented. Everything is legal. It's already done. The color left my wife's face so gradually it was almost like watching a tide go out. I turned to Kieran. I want to be straightforward with you, I said. I spent some time before today building you into something quite significant in my mind. A threat. A problem that needed solving. Sitting there looking at you now, I can see you're just a man who made a very serious mistake and is only now understanding the full dimensions of it. He said nothing. His hands were very still on his knees. The preliminary discussions between Mossgrove Property and Calloway Engineering, I said, have been discontinued. I made that call Thursday morning. The project will be proceeding with a different structural partner. I'd suggest you speak with your board before they hear it through the industry network, which, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is not a large one. He stood up. He said he'd see himself out. He left without the overnight bag. I didn't mention it. My wife and I sat in the living room for a long time after that. I want to tell you honestly what that conversation was like. It was not a scene from a film. There was no operatic grief. She did cry, eventually. And I believe those tears were genuine in their way. I believe that somewhere inside the woman I had been married to for 23 years, there was real sorrow for something real that was ending. But here is what I have come to understand about tears that arrive after consequences rather than before them. They are grief for a future that has just been altered. They are not the same as remorse. And it is important, for your own sake, to know the difference. She asked me when I had decided. From the day you chose the Whitsundays, I said. I didn't know what I was deciding yet, but something in me decided it then. She looked at me for a long time. I thought you'd understand, she said. You were stable. You were safe. I thought you'd be fine. I wasn't asking you to stay because I needed a nurse, I said. I was asking you to stay because my heart stopped and I woke up and you weren't there and I needed to know that you were the kind of person who would choose to be. She had no answer for that. She left at 6:30. I stood at the front window and watched the headlights of her car disappear at the end of the street. Then I called Phil. Come over, I said. Bring dinner. Not from anywhere near the office. Are you all right? He said. I'm better than all right, I said. I'll tell you when you get here. He arrived 40 minutes later with Ty from a place in Paddington, and the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and can feel it beginning to lift. We sat at the kitchen table. I told him everything, every detail, in order. Phil Drummond, who can fill a silence with more words than anyone I have ever worked with, listened without saying a single thing until I finished. Then, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Bernard Calloway, he said slowly, you are the most terrifyingly calm person I have encountered in 60 years on this earth. I laughed. A real laugh. The full, unguarded kind that you don't plan. The kind that surprises you by starting in your chest and going everywhere at once. It felt like the first completely free breath I had taken in a very long time. The divorce was finalized 5 months later. Elaine was meticulous. My wife received what was fair and equitable under the circumstances, which is what I had instructed, because whatever she had done, I was not interested in cruelty. That was never who I was. It is still not who I am, and I consider that one of the few things about myself I am genuinely proud of. The house sold 4 months after that. I bought a smaller place in a suburb I'd always liked, near the river, with a back deck where the afternoon light comes in at the right angle, and a garden that is almost entirely too big for one person to manage, which suits me perfectly. I have been learning, slowly, how to let things be approximately right, without requiring them to be exactly right. Daniel flew up for the settlement. We had dinner the night it was finalized. He raised his glass and didn't make a speech, which was the correct call, and we sat and talked until well after midnight about things that had nothing to do with any of it. He is a good man, my son. I watch him sometimes and think, this one, I did right. Whatever else went sideways, this one came out right. Phil and I have taken on 2 new projects this year. One of them is significant. We are cautiously excited, which for 2 engineers in their 60s is the equivalent of jumping up and down. Dr. Prasad cleared me for full activity at my 6-month check. She reviewed my results and told me, with professional satisfaction, that my numbers were better than she would expect from a man who hadn't nearly died 8 months prior. I told her that near-death experiences are an excellent motivator for taking better care of yourself. She said, with the dry composure of someone who has heard many attempts at cardiac humor, that she preferred patients find other sources of motivation. Sandra, my nurse, passed me in the corridor on the way out of that appointment. She stopped, looked me over with the appraising eye of a woman who has spent 30 years watching people either heal or not, and knows, bone deep, the difference. You look well, Mr. Calloway, she said. I smiled. Sandra, I said, I feel like a man who found out exactly who he was when it mattered most. She studied me for a moment, gave a short, satisfied nod, and went back to her work. They say when you come close to the end, you're supposed to reassess your life, make grand changes, pursue the things that always mattered. And perhaps that is true for some people. But what it did for me, specifically, was simpler and more fundamental than that. It made me stop accepting the version of things that was comfortable and start looking at what was actually there. My wife was not a monster. I want to be clear about that. She was a person who had made a series of choices, each one perhaps small enough in the moment to feel manageable, until the sum of them became something neither of us could live inside anymore. That is not a villainous story. That is a very human one, and I have had enough time now to look at it without the heat and see it for what it was. But it is also true that when my heart stopped, the question that got answered in that hospital room was not one I had ever thought to ask while everything was comfortable. The question was simply, who shows up? And the answer was Phil, and Daniel, and Sandra, with her careful hands and her deliberate expressions, and Elaine, who went through 17 years of shared financial history with a fine-tooth comb because I asked her to, and she believed the work mattered. The answer was not the person I had assumed it would be. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I think it matters more than the legal details and the property settlement and even the confrontation in the living room. A marriage is not a contract that runs itself once it's signed. It is a daily decision made by 2 people, renewed quietly and without ceremony every ordinary morning, in the way they speak to each other, in the things they prioritize, in what they choose to do when the other person most needs them to show up. When those daily decisions stop being made, the contract does not break loudly. It erodes. It goes quiet. It becomes, over time, a structure that looks intact from the outside and has nothing left holding it from within. The crisis did not ruin my marriage. The crisis only revealed what the years had already done. And the second thing, which I think is equally important. The way someone behaves when you are at your most vulnerable is information. It is perhaps the most reliable information you will ever receive about who they are, not who they intend to be, not who they would like you to believe they are, who they actually are. When comfort is on one side of the scale and you are on the other, pay attention to that information. A man can rebuild a house, he can restructure a business and renegotiate a partnership and start a garden in a new suburb and learn, slowly, that solitude is not the same as loneliness, and that peace, real peace, is something you make room for rather than stumble into. I died on a Wednesday in late March, and the man who came back from that edge was quieter, more patient, and, in ways I am still discovering, considerably more alive than the man who had been coasting through comfort for longer than I care to admit. I count that as the best return on investment I have ever seen. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, do us the simple favor of hitting like and subscribing to American Home Voices. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep telling stories that are worth your time. As always, thank you for being here.